Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another podcast of Conversations Beneath the Fig Tree between myself and Reverend Ed Nelson. This particular podcast, I'm asking Ed a question. And if you haven't noticed, Ed is a well repository of biblical knowledge, as he has been in ministry for over 60 years. But I asked him a question because he and I started to study together about 27 years ago when I first met him. And his interest in interpretive understanding and the languages matched mine. But he opened me to a line of study that I had not been engaged in before that period of time. And as we discuss biblical interpretation, I thought tonight I would ask him a question to see if over the years, at least the last few number of years that he and I have been studying together, if he has made any adjustments or corrections or thoughts pertaining to biblical interpretation itself and the Hebraic methods. For I know that he was engaged in further study with some other influential teachers. And so that will be my preliminary question. So welcome once again to what is our fifth podcast of Conversations Beneath the Fig Tree. We had some really good discussion, and I had one of the students is a gentleman. He was supposed to present his verbal report, and he did it by just reading from Genesis 1, and then launched into that. It just kind of blew his mind how much he did not know. He goes, I thought I had a command of Genesis, but I realized I didn't. And so he starts launching into all these questions from the text of early Genesis. And he gave me a compliment. He goes, this is all Pastor Jack's fault because of teaching us to ask questions of the text, And I'm sitting there and I'm liking it because he's asking, well, there's this, and then there was that, and then there was this. And so I just listened. And when he was done, I said, there are answers to many of those questions, but they won't come by way of your normal hermeneutic. You need to ask questions and then go into it. And then my lecture was actually 23 years ago in the Hebraic Roots E-group that I had written on a little thing, Zechariah's genealogy, Zechariah and Elizabeth. And it was a 4-parter, so it was extensive. But it was a shemology as well as a genealogy. I've got your material on the genealogies, Toledoth, and that was a major paper. Well, not major, but I think it was at least 14 pages or something like that, which is a good size, little paper. And I'm just trying to insert them into my Old Testament survey class, where it fits in, augmenting the text, showing them some things they hadn't seen before. So it was just basically introducing. And I said, this would be how you might do research by using the Old Testament to verify and bring understanding to the New Testament. So we went through all of the genealogies, and I'm standing there trying to read all of these Hebrew names. Most of them I'm fine with. There are some others it's like, I don't know. I didn't get tripped up too much, but it was, name after. And then closing it out, I closed it out with a shemology of genealogy of Zechariah, going back to Aaron, but it went from, and then Aaron forward. And what I found in that was this shemology, which was a prophetic word of encouragement to Zechariah, is then matching almost, not word for word because it was quite more extensive, his word of praise that he gave after, his son is born, then he launches into this exaltation of the Lord. And it mirrored that Shemology, just expanding and augmenting, but following it and following the main thoughts. So the problem was I ran right up to the end of the hour and didn't have any chance for anyone to respond. It was like 8 o'clock. The other teacher had come around the corner, standing in the back with a couple students who were joining that particular class, so not sure what they thought of it, but it's just to let them know there's more, So
Yeah.
what I was hoping to talk about a little bit is that as I'm dealing with hermeneutic quite a bit and the class on Pentateuch that I'm teaching, as well as Old Testament, I gave an introductory lecture on Hebraic hermeneutic on Pardes. And it just reminded me of our conversations and things that you have written, even including into my doctoral project, some comments concerning Greco-Roman hermeneutic. And
Mhm.
I thought I'd just ask you to, one of the questions is, have you, since that time, that's at least 20 years or more ago, okay? That goes back to the Hebraic roots and beyond, before that, you were already, and maybe going back 40 years or so, I don't know. But you're dealing with this Greco-Roman hermeneutic as compared to the more Hebraic hermeneutic that you've
Mhm.
been engaged in. Um, anything that has changed, anything that has become more important, anything, was there
Well,
anything
there's
that you might re-examine or
I
ask, did you do
I
it
have a
right?
glossary that I keep working on. I've probably worked on it since we worked on it years ago. Um, I'm sure I worked on that glossary around the year 2000, somewhere in there, 2000, and I started building pieces of it actually going back to the time I was in seminary. That goes back into the 1970s, um, late 60s, early 70s. I started building on things. Now, at that time, I read a lot of books on hermeneutics. I read everything on hermeneutics because I had been taught there in seminary that everything hinges on hermeneutics as to where you go with the scriptures. And so I studied every kind of hermeneutic I could find a book on what's called the new hermeneutic, and and a lot of stuff was just pure European stuff that came out of the 20th century liberalism. So I read all that, but somewhere I started writing, and I really started compiling a glossary in earnest um, around the year 2000, and that glossary is now 8 pages long. Now it embraces more than the hermeneutics of Greco-Roman and the Hebraic. Well, I say more. It embraces both of those, but it does not embrace the Greco-Roman hermeneutic as the one of choice. It rather suggests it's not the one of choice. That glossary, it takes up the concepts like Pardes, Pithron, which was, Pithron, P-I-T-H-R-O-N, it's pronounced, the H is silent, like the house Beth, that H is silent. I didn't know that when I started taking this course in the yeshiva I took a few years ago. And I had to learn Hebrew again because I was learning now from people who lived in Israel, and they don't speak it the way I learned it. And so they said, stop saying the th, and just say t, t. So I said, okay. So I would say Pithrin. They said, no, not Pithrin, Pitrin. And so I had to start learning that. So don't say Beth anymore. Say Bet. I learned that. And so Elizabeth. All that changed. But the pronunciation affected me. But then taking that yeshiva course, that was also eye-opening for me, and not only in the pronunciation of words, but some concepts I had never entertained. And I think today, looking back at it even now, some of those concepts are far-fetched. They're based on more Kabbalahism than they are on first century concepts. So I have tried to parse. I started off parsing the Greco-Roman worldview and isolating those ideas. Then I started doing the isolation of the concepts of the Hebraic worldview, and I had to parse that because there's divergencies in that, and it depends on how akin they are to Kabbalah as to how strange they come. So I said, okay, I'm going to push that back, and I'm just going to stay with the cusp of the cup. I'm going to stay with the handle of the cup, but not the ornaments on it. And so I went back to again the first century, revisited, of course, and the Second Temple period in particular, starting with the return from Babylon, and of course the Babylonian Academy remained, and the Jerusalem Academy. So I went to those two academies and began to look at what their views were. They're very similar, and as a result of that, you have two Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud.
Yes.
Come from those two different traditions. So I went back into that and started trying to figure that out. And then I learned words. And this is not where the Q is not understood in English. It's a K, T-I-K-K-U-N, the tikkun olam, to repair the world. Tikkun. Anyway, the word tikkun means to repair, to reform, to fix.
Mm-hmm.
And then I discovered that tikkunot, that's a plural form, meant reforms, enactments, but had become, in the Second Temple period, a part of the hermeneutic. And this is the problem with it. This is where I said I had to do some parsing. Yeshua talked about the tradition of the elders, and they were dependent upon two basic concepts that changed the Bible, the Torah, the prophets, the writings. One was tikkunot, which means they would make enactments that would reform the text. And the other was maasim. It means deeds or acts or works, the works of the Torah. You've heard that phrase. The works of the Torah, the works of the law, the works of the Torah. Well, that word is maasim, M-A'-A-S-I-M. It was applied by Pharisees, and it was adopted and adapted by the later rabbinic Judaism. And it means that acts or deeds that serve as precedents in obeying oral tradition. So what happened is that tikkunot and maasim became two primary hermeneutical devices, techniques, used in the Second Temple period by the sages and then later by the rabbinic rabbis in order to change the biblical understanding, the biblical interpretation, where it just stands alone as the Bible or the Torah, the prophets, the writings. And the authority of the sage and the authority of the rabbi was that they could do precedents, make declarations, and change the meanings that were not intended in the original context of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And that became that's part of the oral tradition. And the oral tradition was an interpretive device that was solid at times, but also used takanot and ma'asim to alter the text to fit their narratives. In certain rare cases, they even changed the Masoretic. Well, the text, which later we found evidence of that in the Masoretic text, actually changes the text to fit a narrative of the oral tradition. So by the usage of these two hermeneutical devices, they were able to do the works of the Torah, the precedents, which were different from the Torah. They could add to, they could add burdens upon the people, restrictions that were binding. And they used the third concept here. It was that they used a legitimate biblical tool of interpretation called binding and loosing. And they took that also, and to their takanot, and to their masim, they made it binding. That was illegitimate. And that is where the issues between Yeshua, he wasn't against all the oral tradition. He was against the oral tradition that bound the people or loosed the people, where the Torah, the prophets, and the writings never intended. And usually they were highly burdensome on the people.
Right.
So I changed. So Pardes is probably the most innocent of all the techniques. And the other is binding and loosing, which is a legitimate one. Mm-hmm. But it was misused, abused. And so the oral tradition brought a hermeneutic that altered the text of the Bible when it's being interpreted. So I try to just say, yeah, Greco-Roman, no, not at all, because it's based on philosophy, philosophical principles. But here, there is really a rupture in interpretation in the Second Temple period, particularly by the first century, a rupture in interpretation. Now, it already had occurred a century earlier among the Sadducees and the Pharisees, but now it's flourished. And you have people like Hillel and Shammai. And Hillel came up with his own 7 rules of interpretation. And Yeshua used those. He used all 7 of them. So I found those usages. I found Paul using those. So I said, okay, those are okay.
Yeah. I would ask a question, or just what you were just saying is the movement within rabbinical Judaism, a time past Christ, okay, that they began to change the meaning of the text. And the understanding that we have with Pardes is that no matter what level of interpretive understanding you have, you never leave the plain meaning of the text.
That is correct. And they changed when they wouldn't fit the narrative, they would change the narrative.
Yeah. Which is one of the major rules. You don't change.
Yeah, they can't. And that's why I'm saying you can see that Hillel, which was a century earlier, I mean, like before the formation of rabbinic Judaism.
Right.
He had these 7 rules. But Ishmael, at AD 135, it comes out with his 13 rules, and they're based on the oral tradition, and he modifies Hillel. Mm-hmm. because he wanted more of this. He wanted they wanted this oral tradition to be equal to or greater than the written Torah, prophets, and writings. And so that bias, I became really keen to it, and over the years, and I don't think that you and I have really talked about these things since we talked about the Pardes in those days. But now I say, okay, Pardes is fine. But even in the rabbinic tradition, a century later, they began to modify Pardes, with enactments, precedents, alterations, modifications, so that it would fit another narrative. It would fit their narrative. And the authority of the rabbi was greater than the authority of God. And that is the feeling and the belief that heaven, as they say, a euphemism for God, heaven will change its mind for the sake of a rabbi.
Well, that's Daniel Boyarin wrote about that one time when he had written his one text that he was criticized for it as if, but he was also saying that even though there was a lot of truth in recognizing the teachings of Christianity, all right, the Jews, it was okay for them to change their mind. It was fine.
Right.
So, and here he is, this great Talmudic scholar saying, okay, I know this is, because what he was saying is we believe this once, we don't believe it anymore. Believing that Isaiah 53 was about the suffering Messiah.
Right.
Now and he goes, yeah, we're allowed, we're Jews, we're allowed to change our mind.
We're allowed to change it. And the rabbi speaks, it's changed.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking, okay, that's somewhat a major difference from us. We're not looking to change the text. We're trying to understand the text in its context, in its time.
Which is the view of Yeshua.
Yes.
And Paul and Hillel and Gamliel, the teacher of Paul, Shaul, Paul. That was let's stay consistent with the Peshat, the simple, plain meaning. And then we will find the sud, the secret or the mystery. We'll find that. But we're going to keep that Peshat in place. That has to be the standard. We can't go modify the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
The narrative has to modify us. But we don't modify the narrative. And those are the big issues that arose in the first century and earlier that have been in preponderance ever since. So we're talking about you asked the question, have I changed my mind? I haven't really changed my mind. I have just gotten more educated in the nuances of the hermeneutics of the Second Temple period, and I was already educated in the nuances of the Greco-Roman hermeneutic, which I cannot use except that which affirms what I already know from the Hebraic. I won't use anything from a Greco-Roman worldview that is not first and foremost already in the Hebraic worldview, because the word Hermes or hermeneutics, comes from the mediator god Hermes. In the human world, there was a great divide, a disparagement. In the human world, there was the male and the female. The male had the divine spark in him. The female did not. This is the hermeneutic of the Greco-Roman world. So the divine spark's in the man. The woman, no. She is of the earth. The man is partly of the earth, but he has this divine spark in him. And it gives him the right to make interpretations of things, interpret life, that his wife does not have, or his children, his female children don't have the right to interpret life. They just take the orders. So the Greco-Roman worldview really suppressed women terribly. They were like chattel property. They were like a higher level than animals, but nothing. But the man was far superior. So there was a dualism between the male and the female. There was a dualism between what is holy and what is profane. That's the Greco-Roman worldview. It was had a dualism to it. You'll find it in Aristotle, but you profoundly find it in Plato, and you find it in the development of Plato's teachings as they were reformed, revised, and quote improved upon by people like Plotinus in the 2nd century. And he was the rock star of the age of the 2nd century, Plotinus, and who was so influential, though he was not a quote Christian, he greatly influenced the Greek and the Latin church fathers, because Plotinus was to them like a Hermes, a mediator of knowledge. So you can really get critical here on those great Greek and Latin church fathers that founded the church in the 3rd and 4th and centuries, because they come from that. Came from a pagan worldview. They came from a Greco-Roman worldview, which formed their view of life, the superiority of the male over the female, the dualism of what's holy and sacred and what is profane and secular. The very views that we talk about today in American society and European society are derived from that dualistic worldview and not from the Bible. That's why people in the church talk about the devil all the time as if he's the opposite to God. All the time, giving credit, all the time. You hear it all the time. I mean, it just drives me crazy to hear Christians testifying about how they owe the devil, always got the devil in everything they're doing. And I'm thinking, that's dualism.
But you have in Eastern religions the yin and the...
Oh yeah, you have that. You have the yin and yang too.
Yeah.
Yes, you do.
It's a...
But anyway, that hermeneutic, that's why the cruelty of it, and that came right out of that dualism of Neoplatonism, right into the established church by first the Greek and then the Latin, as used today interpreting the Bible in the Christian church. And that's sad, it's unfortunate. I mentioned this mediator god named Hermes because that was a god that was a mediator that allowed to interpret. He brought the interpretation of the mythology to the human to understand the gods that was unapproachable and where there's this disparagement and there would never be connections there. Well, this mythological god named Hermes, from which the word hermeneutics comes from, means that which can interpret. And so I don't like the word hermeneutics as a result of that. I use the word Bible interpretation, because I don't want it to be based on some mythological mediator god of the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods. But before the term hermeneutics is the classic term for the study of the Bible interpretation used today. And again, that is a Greek word that goes back to mythology and philosophy. And to me, it's misguided, it's misdirected, and we should not be borrowing from mythology to explain the revelation of God Almighty. and I think it's a mistake. You remember that Hermes, that mythological god of the Greeks, would be objectionable to any Hebrew person in the first century. A Hebrew person would now there would be an exception to that, probably in Alexandria with Philo, where he was teaching the Greek philosophy. But outside of that, you got to go to Alexandria to get that in Egypt. But as far as the land of Judea and the surrounding, into Antioch and those areas, no way were the Jewish people or the Hebrew people going to use Hermes as the means of explaining to them the revelation of God in history. If you remember the Lord of Yahweh, and he was explaining that Messiah is God in flesh, and he was going and explaining the whole story from a Jewish or Hebrew worldview of the revelation of God in history in the Messiah, Yeshua. And if you remember, the Lystrans heard that and began to acclaim him, which was abhorrent to his sensibilities, began to acclaim him as a God himself for his power to interpret. Because the Greco-Roman worldview was what they had. And they started seeing Paul as a divine figure, as a incarnation, so to speak, of Hermes. So it's right there in the 14th chapter of the book of Acts, that whole story. And he denied it, of course. He denied being Hermes. And it caused a social and political upheaval immediately that threatened his life. But it goes to illustrate the power of the Greco-Roman worldview could be violent. And in this case, it was. Mm-hmm. Where Paul's gospel and his interpretation of Yeshua was not about violence, but about the love of God manifest in Yeshua. So it's better to stay with the Hebrew worldview of the first century as held by the Judean Nazarene community. That community, and I'm not talking about, and you could throw other Jewish people into that historically before that time, like Hillel, or even Shammai to a degree, but Hillel particularly, and Simon, the son of Hillel, Shimon, and Gamaliel, I think he's called in the church, the teacher of Shaul, of Paul. So, but Paul never adapted, never adopted the Greco-Roman worldview, nor adapted his message to fit it. That's why he could not succeed when he went to Athens. He stayed Hebraic in explaining the gospel to a people who wanted to hear a Greco-Roman philosophical, mythological understanding. That's why he chose that one side to the God who's unknown. He began to explain. So hermeneutics is critically important, and it's good to sort through it and not come up with your own hermeneutic, but push and drive ourselves back to that pristine hermeneutic of the Judean Nazarene community of faith in the Messiah of the first century. That's where we need to go. So it has a long answer to a short question. Have I changed my views? I've only expanded my views.
Yeah. You introduced that topic to me of a different hermeneutic many years ago. And I have gone through and purchased many books by Jewish scholars. I've got a collection of the Talmud on my shelf, among the Chumash and other books on Torah and so on. And it's weeding through and understanding what to let go of. The podcast that Ed and I were doing was interrupted, and I did not finish my final sentence, nor did Ed and I get to say goodbye. But just talking about the sources that we have used, especially Jewish sources, was saying that you need to know what to also let go of and what to hold on to. You ask questions, especially of non-canonical text of any kind. You ask the question, does it agree with the biblical text in its meaning, purpose, and truth? And so we leave it at that point right now and say thank you for listening to this podcast, Conversations Beneath the Fig Tree. And we're going to be picking up on this topic. Biblical interpretation will run through practically all of our conversations, because that is what we're doing. When we're talking about the Bible, we're always interpreting. We're always involved with these principles. And so you'll hear us mentioning that again and again, and perhaps go a little bit deeper and be clearer. You know, the text that I was mentioning by Daniel Boyarin earlier is the text that he wrote a book, The Jewish Gospels, where he was highly criticized by many other in rabbinical Judaism who thought that he was writing a text in agreement with the New Testament. And what he was writing in agreement was what was held by the ancient Jews, especially around the time of Jesus, around the time of Messiah, that those truths remain truthful. And as a scholar, he has the integrity to include that and say that. Although he did then mention it was okay for him as a Jewish scholar, as Ed was speaking, the rabbis, if the rabbis say things now, they preempt and they change interpretive understanding of Scripture. We don't do that. So we conclude this particular podcast and hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, please leave them for us. I check it out and I look at it, and Ed and I will try to answer some questions if you have them of us. If you would like to be in touch and like to know more of the materials that we use ourselves in our studies, we'd be happy to provide that to you. There are papers that Ed has written, as he's been a teacher of Torah for many, many years, that he would most likely be willing to share with you. But we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to have a conversation with you if you'd like. But hit like, talk to other people about us, because we want to just share these conversations. So I'll say goodnight and God bless you. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe for further notifications when new videos are available.